Welcome to Cluster Fudge. I'm your host, Alexandra. Today, we're diving into a subject everyone knows about, but few seem to want to face head-on: America's gun problem. It's in the headlines every day. Mass shootings, everyday gun violence, the debate over gun rights versus gun control. But here's the kicker. Everybody knows we have a gun problem. The real question is, do we want to solve it? Let's unpack that today. The scope of the gun problem. Let's start with what we actually mean when we say America has a gun problem. Because it's not just a buzz phrase. This isn't some abstract idea floating around in politics or Twitter threads. The numbers, the real-life statistics, paint a devastating picture. In 2023, over 45,000 people in the United States died from gun-related injuries. That's more than 120 people a day. Think about that. That's a packed commercial airplane crashing every day, killing everyone on board. Would we accept that? No. But somehow we've normalized gun deaths. Let's break that number down. More than 60% of those gun deaths were suicides. That's over 26,000 people who used a firearm to end their own lives. Roughly 36%, about 17,000 people, died due to gun homicides, and the remaining deaths were due to unintentional shootings, police shootings, and undetermined causes. These aren't just statistics. These are sons, daughters, parents, friends, people whose lives ended because a gun was accessible in a moment of crisis or conflict. Mass shootings. Get the headlines, but they're not the whole story. When you hear about gun violence in the media, what comes to mind? Probably a mass shooting at a school or a shopping mall, right? And yeah, those are horrifying. In 2022 and 2023, mass shootings occurred at record high rates, more than 600 mass shootings per year. That's nearly 2 per day. But mass shootings, as traumatic and visible as they are, represent only a sliver of the overall gun violence crisis. The majority of gun deaths happen quietly, without media attention. A domestic violence incident here, a suicide there, a neighborhood dispute that escalates into deadly violence, or a child who finds a loaded gun left in a drawer. Why are suicides so common? Let's talk about that suicide statistic because it's crucial and often overlooked. Guns are the most lethal method of suicide. Over 85% of suicide attempts involving a firearm are fatal. Compare that to drug overdoses or self-harm by cutting, which are far less likely to be fatal, not because they aren't serious, but because they give people a chance to survive and seek help. In rural communities, where gun ownership is more prevalent and mental health services are scarce, the suicide rate is especially high. The presence of a gun doesn't create depression, but it turns a crisis into a death sentence in a matter of seconds. Disproportionate impact on marginalized communities. And while suicide dominates the national numbers, gun homicide disproportionately affects black and brown communities, especially young black men. Let me hit you with this. According to CDC data, the leading cause of death for black men aged 15 to 34 is homicide by firearm. Not cancer, not heart disease, guns. These deaths often occur in neighborhoods already impacted by poverty, underfunded schools, limited healthcare access, and heavy policing. So when we talk about solving the gun crisis, we also have to talk about structural inequality. Gun violence is both a public health issue and a social justice issue. Gun violence and children. And then there's the impact on kids. In 2022, firearms became the leading cause of death for children and teens in the United States. That should stop everyone in their tracks. We have kids being killed in schools, in their homes, in parks, on their way to the corner store. And many of these deaths come from unsecured weapons that are legally owned by adults but left within reach. What kind of society shrugs at that? How we compare to the world. It's not just an American problem in the sense that bad things happen here. It's a uniquely American problem in terms of scale. Let me give you some perspective. The US has about 4% of the world's population, but owns nearly 46% of the world's civilian guns. Compared to other high-income countries, the US gun homicide rate is 25 times higher. A person in America is more likely to die from a gun than from a car accident in many states. Countries like Australia, New Zealand, and the UK have experienced mass shootings, but implemented reforms like buybacks and stricter regulations. The results? Fewer gun deaths, fewer mass shootings, and fewer grieving families. So when people say there's nothing we can do, that's just not true. We're choosing not to. A public health crisis, not just a political issue. If gun deaths were caused by a virus, we'd declare a national emergency. There would be task forces, federal funding, research grants, public awareness campaigns. But because it's guns, and guns are tied to power, politics, and identity, we treat this epidemic like background noise. And here's the truth. Gun violence is a public health emergency. It's not about taking rights away, it's about preserving life. The scope of the gun problem is massive. And it's not just one thing. It's suicides, it's homicides, it's accidents, it's systemic inequality, it's mental health, it's toxic masculinity, it's legislative paralysis, it's all of it. The next time someone tries to reduce this conversation to guns don't kill people, people do, remind them. We're the only country where this happens like clockwork. So the problem isn't just who has a gun. The real issue is, why are we so comfortable living with this level of violence? Coming up next, why solving this, despite all we know, remains so incredibly hard. Why solving it is so hard. So if we know the numbers, if we know that tens of thousands of people are dying, that our kids are afraid to go to school, that families are being torn apart every single day, why aren't we doing anything? Why is America still stuck in this Groundhog Day loop, where the same tragedy happens, the same thoughts and prayers are tweeted, and then silence, crickets, until the next mass shooting, and the cycle repeats? Let's get into it. The Second Amendment, sacred or stuck? First, we have to talk about the Second Amendment. It's often thrown around like a magic shield, as if any effort to regulate guns is unconstitutional. Let me read it real quick. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now that was written in 1791, before the Civil War, before the AR-15, before school shootings. But to many, it remains untouchable, a holy document carved into the foundation of American identity. And here's the problem. For a lot of people, gun ownership isn't about hunting or home defense. It's about power, autonomy, and rebellion. It's almost religious. So even the suggestion of background checks or red flag laws is met with paranoia and resistance. They're coming to take our guns. We're not having policy debates, we're having ideological wars. Political paralysis. Congress is bought and frozen. Let's be blunt, money rules policy, and few industries spend as aggressively on lobbying as the gun industry and its allies. Take the NRA, National Rifle Association, for example. It used to be a sportsman's organisation. Now, it's a political machine. The NRA has spent hundreds of millions influencing lawmakers and elections. They score politicians. If a Republican even considers a gun safety law, they might get a failing NRA rating, and boom, their career's over. So even when 90% of Americans support universal background checks, Congress still can't pass them, because special interest groups flood the system with dark money and disinformation. Democracy is being held hostage. And let's not pretend Democrats are immune. Plenty of centrist Democrats, especially in gun-friendly states, don't want to risk re-election by pushing for strong reforms. 3. Misinformation and fear, a manufactured culture war. Here's something that needs to be said. We're not living in the same reality anymore. The gun debate has been twisted and weaponized by media and political echo chambers. You've got entire news networks and YouTube channels feeding people this apocalyptic vision of a government that's seconds away from confiscating all weapons and imposing tyranny. So instead of asking, how do we save lives? People are asking, how do we make sure the government can't take my AR-15? This fear isn't based on fact. It's based on identity, tribalism, and fear-mongering. Gun ownership has become part of people's cultural DNA, especially in rural America. It's seen as a sign of freedom, of masculinity, of Americanness. So the minute you try to introduce logic, statistics, or health-focused solutions, it's dismissed as liberal propaganda. 4. The normalization of violence. Another huge barrier? We've become numb. Gun violence is so common, so constant, that it's become background noise. People hear about a school shooting and their reaction isn't shock, it's exhaustion. Again, that numbness is dangerous because it means we're no longer reacting with urgency. We've accepted it as part of American life, like bad traffic or overpriced healthcare. We watch shows and movies filled with glamorized gun violence. We play video games where killing is a default action. This isn't to blame entertainment, but it is part of a broader culture that treats guns as normal. Legal loopholes, state-by-state chaos. Even when we do pass gun laws, the patchwork nature of US legislation makes it all nearly pointless. One state might have strict background checks, while the one next door lets you buy a weapon at a gun show with zero oversight. Straw purchases, where someone buys a gun for someone who legally can't, are rampant and often untraceable. Ghost guns, unregistered, untraceable firearms made from kits, are flooding the streets with no regulation at all. We're fighting a national crisis with local tools, and that just doesn't work. 6. Courts that roll back progress. Even when laws do make it through, they're not safe. Recent Supreme Court decisions have made it harder for states to enforce gun restrictions. In 2022, the court struck down a New York law that required people to prove a special need to carry concealed weapons in public. That sent a clear message: the legal trend is leaning away from restrictions and toward expanded gun rights. So even with mass public support and a crisis spiraling out of control, the judicial system is pushing in the opposite direction. Last but not least, there's this cloud of hopelessness hanging over the conversation. People throw up their hands and say nothing will change. We've had kids killed in classrooms, people murdered in churches, concert goers gunned down in droves. And still, no sweeping change. That sense of defeat is dangerous, because when people believe nothing can change, they stop trying. But here's the truth. Change is possible. We've seen it in other countries. We've even seen it at the local level here in the US. States with strong gun laws have fewer gun deaths. Community-based violence intervention programs work. Safe storage laws reduce child deaths. The real question is, do we want to solve it, or do we just want to grieve in peace until it happens again? So what makes solving the gun crisis so hard? It's not just the guns. It's politics. It's propaganda, it's paralysis, it's fear, it's tribalism, it's money, and maybe most tragically, it's apathy. But those barriers aren't insurmountable, they're just convenient excuses, and as long as we keep making them, more people will die. Coming up in the next segment, let's talk about the myths, because if we're ever going to move forward, we've got to stop repeating the same tired lies. The impact of media and public perception. So here's something we don't talk about enough when it comes to America's gun problem: how the media shapes what we believe, what we fear, and what we ignore. Because it's not just about laws and politics, it's about narratives. And in America, the story we tell ourselves about guns has been twisted, polished, and sold to the point where truth barely stands a chance. Let's unpack that. 1. The power of visibility, what we see versus what we don't. When you turn on the news and hear about a mass shooting, it's usually the big ones that make headlines. A school, a mall, a movie theatre. These events are tragic, horrifying, and absolutely deserve coverage. But here's the issue. They only make up a small fraction of gun deaths in the US. What we don't see are the daily shootings in black and brown neighbourhoods. We don't see the suicides, which, by the way, account for over 50% of gun deaths in America. We rarely hear about domestic violence involving firearms, even though women are 5 times more likely to be killed in domestic disputes when a gun is present. So media coverage creates this perception that gun violence is random and spectacular, when the reality is it's constant, quiet, and happening everywhere. This warped visibility creates a hierarchy of attention, and that shapes public urgency, or lack of it. 2. Entertainment media, guns as symbols of power. Let's talk Hollywood. Movies, TV shows, video games, they're saturated with guns. But not just guns, cool guns, shiny, sleek, powerful, carried by heroes, used to save the day. We're not just seeing violence, we're seeing a story where violence is justified, they're even glorified, as long as the right person pulls the trigger. In pop culture, the action star gets revenge with a gun. The good guy solves problems with bullets. The villain is taken out with one final glorious headshot. This conditions us to associate guns with justice, masculinity, and control. It's not accidental. It's branding. And it bleeds into real life, where some people buy a gun not out of necessity, but out of fantasy. Ask any firearms dealer. Action movies move inventory. 3. The news cycle and sensationalism. Mass shootings are often reported with the killer's name, photos, manifestos, dramatic headlines, rolling coverage. But what that does is amplify the shooter's voice, while often minimizing the lives of the victims. In some cases, it even inspires copycats. Studies have shown a contagion effect, where one mass shooting is followed by a spike in others within 13 days. What if instead of naming the shooter, we focused on the survivors? What if instead of sensationalizing the violence, we humanized the loss? The way we report influences what we value and what we normalize. 4. Social media. Echo chambers and outrage algorithms. Then there's social media, the new town square. You'd think with all this access to information, we'd be more educated on gun policy, gun deaths, and data. But in reality, social media often spreads more confusion than clarity. Why? Because outrage sells, and algorithms prioritize emotion over accuracy. On Twitter or TikTok, you might see a clip of someone misusing a statistic, a video claiming the government is coming for your guns, a viral post blaming gun violence on mental illness without any facts. These platforms can create ideological echo chambers where people only hear what confirms what they already believe. That makes it even harder to have productive conversations across political lines. 5. Public perception. Who is a criminal? Let's go deeper for a second. Who do you picture when I say shooter? For many people, the media has trained us to default to a young black man with sagging pants and a mugshot. But that's not the full picture, not even close. Many mass shooters are white men. Many school shooters are teenagers from suburban backgrounds. Most gun suicides are by older white men. But the media often racializes gun violence. Shootings in marginalized communities are treated like background noise. But when a suburban school is targeted, suddenly it's a national tragedy. That racialized lens affects policy too. It leads to more policing of black and brown communities, but no action on universal background checks or red flag laws that could prevent all types of shootings. 6. What the media doesn't talk about. Lastly, let's talk about silence, because some of the most dangerous media influence isn't in what's said, but in what's ignored. We rarely hear about gun trafficking networks, the gun industry's financial incentives, how easy it is to bypass laws with straw purchases, or the fact that gun deaths in America outpace every other developed nation. By failing to dig deeper, the media helps the public accept the problem as unsolvable, and that perception becomes self-fulfilling. So when people say it's just too complicated, what they're really saying is, we've been trained to look away. Media isn't just a mirror, it's a magnifier. It decides what matters. It tells us who to fear, who to grieve, who to forget. If we want to solve this crisis, we need a new story, one that centers truth, not theatrics, one that honors victims instead of empowering killers, one that teaches us to care, not just when it's trending. The human toll and stories behind the numbers. Let's stop for a second and move away from charts, laws, and headlines. Because gun violence isn't just a political issue. It's not just a statistic. It's a human tragedy, and the cost is measured in lives shattered, families broken, and communities scarred forever. In this segment, we're talking about the human toll, the real people behind the numbers, the ones who don't make it into the news cycle, the ones whose trauma doesn't end after the gunfire stops. 1. Survivors, the wounds you can't see. When we think of gun violence, we often think about death. But for every person killed, there are 2 more who survive and live with the aftermath. That includes paralysis, brain injuries, amputations, PTSD, nightmares that never end. Many survivors can't work again. Many can't walk. Some can't even speak. And yet once they leave the hospital, they're forgotten. Insurance rarely covers long-term therapy. Mental health services are scarce, and society treats them like they should be grateful just to be alive. Imagine being 19, shot at a party, and now living the rest of your life in a wheelchair while the shooter never gets caught. That's not just survival, that's a new kind of prison. 2. Families, the grief that never leaves. Then there's the families, the mother who keeps her son's room exactly the same years after he was killed in a drive-by, the father who breaks down every time he passes the elementary school where his daughter died in a classroom massacre, the sister who can't celebrate her birthday anymore because it falls on the same day her brother was shot. Gun deaths are not isolated events. They are ripples. One bullet can change dozens of lives. Parents become activists because they have to, not because they want to. Siblings grow up angry, afraid, or numb. Children are raised in homes where the sound of a popping balloon triggers panic. This is what the stats don't show you. This is what the term collateral damage really means. 3. Children and trauma. Let's talk about the kids. In cities like Philadelphia, Detroit, and Chicago, there are 10-year-olds who know how to duck gunfire better than they know how to spell multiplication. Children who've lost classmates to shootings. Kids who don't feel safe walking to school. Research shows that growing up around gun violence causes chronic anxiety, trouble focusing in class, depression, sleep disturbances, behavioral problems. And it doesn't just hurt the victims, it holds back entire communities. How can a child learn if they're afraid? How can a teenager dream if their best friend was killed last summer? We are raising a generation with untreated trauma, and that trauma has consequences, long-term consequences. In many communities, especially those over-policed and under-resourced, gun violence often breeds retaliation. One shooting leads to another. A cousin gets killed, so a friend takes matters into his own hands. There's no justice, so people look for revenge, and suddenly the grief turns into rage. The funeral turns into a feud, and the cycle spins on. This isn't just about crime, it's about broken trust in the system, in the police, in society. When people don't believe justice is possible, they look for their own version of it, even if it costs another life. Economic impact of gun violence on survivors and communities. Gun violence doesn't just ruin lives, it drains economies too. Let's talk numbers for a second. According to the Giffords Law Center, gun violence costs America over $280 billion each year. That includes emergency room visits, law enforcement response, lost productivity, long-term disability, legal proceedings, mental health care. And that burden disproportionately falls on poor and working-class communities, many of which were already under pressure. When a breadwinner is shot and can't work again, that family could fall into poverty. When gun violence keeps businesses away, neighborhoods don't grow. When schools are locked down or underfunded, kids fall behind. So it's not just about compassion. It's about the systemic cost of doing nothing. Listening to voices we ignore. Let me ask you this. When was the last time you saw a documentary about a gun violence survivor from your own city? When was the last time a shooting victim got more than 15 seconds on the news? We have to start telling their stories, because until we do, gun violence will remain an abstract debate instead of the emergency that it is. Let's amplify. The mother running a support group out of her garage. The teacher trying to help her students heal. The kid who turned his trauma into poetry instead of violence. These are the real voices. These are the ones that matter. Gun violence is not just a political problem, it's a human problem. And every number we throw around, every statistic, was a person, a name, a heartbeat, a future. If we let ourselves become numb, we've already lost. If we want to fix this, we have to feel it first. Possible solutions and why they matter. All right, we've talked about the scope of the problem, we've talked about the pain, the politics, and the perception, but now it's time to move forward. This segment is called Possible Solutions and Why They Matter, and it's about more than laws. It's about commitment, because if we agree there's a problem, the real question becomes, what are we actually willing to do about it? Let's break it down. Act 1. Universal background checks. Let's start with the most widely supported and frankly common sense solution. Universal background checks. Right now, in many US states, private gun sales, like at gun shows or through online platforms, don't require background checks. That's called the gun show loophole, and it's as reckless as it sounds. Here's the fix. A federal law mandating background checks for all gun purchases, regardless of whether they happen at a licensed store, a flea market, or from a neighbour. Why it matters. It helps prevent people with violent criminal histories, domestic abuse convictions, or severe mental illness from buying firearms. It's supported by over 90% of Americans, including a majority of gun owners. This isn't about taking guns away. It's about making sure they don't end up in the wrong hands. Red flag laws. Next up, extreme risk protection orders, also known as red flag laws. These laws allow family members or law enforcement to petition a court to temporarily remove firearms from someone who is considered a danger to themselves or others. Imagine you're a mother and your son is spiraling into depression and posting suicidal messages online, or threatening violence after a breakup. Wouldn't you want a way to intervene? Why it matters. It's already saved lives in states like Connecticut and Indiana. It helps prevent mass shootings and gun suicides before they happen. This is about giving people, especially families, the tools to protect their loved ones before tragedy strikes. 3, holding the gun industry accountable. One major barrier to reform is the gun lobby and the fact that gun manufacturers are uniquely protected from liability. Unlike car companies or pharmaceutical corporations, gun makers cannot be sued for the harm their products cause due to the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, PAA, passed in 2005. What can be done? Repeal or amend PLCAA to allow lawsuits against gun makers and sellers who act irresponsibly. Implement mandatory product safety standards for firearms, just like we have for almost every other product. Why it matters? It would force manufacturers to innovate around safety, just like automakers did with seatbelts and airbags. It would reduce the number of straw purchases and negligent gun sales. Accountability drives change, and it's time the gun industry played by the same rules. Invest in community-based violence intervention, CVI. Not all solutions come from Washington, D.C. In fact, some of the most effective interventions are happening at the community level. Programs like Cure Violence, Advance Peace, Operation Peacemaker Fellowship. These programs focus on violence interrupters, former gang members, or community leaders who mediate conflicts before they turn deadly. Why it matters. Studies have shown CVI programs can reduce gun violence by 30 to 60% in urban neighborhoods. They're grounded in trust, trauma-informed care, and local leadership. These aren't just band-aids, they are real, scalable strategies that actually save lives where the problem is most acute. 5, mental health support and gun ownership. Yes, let's talk about mental health, but not as a scapegoat. People with mental illness are far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. That said, suicide accounts for over half of all gun deaths in the US, and many of those deaths are impulsive, with access to a gun making all the difference. Solutions here include mandatory waiting periods, a cooling off time between purchasing and receiving a gun, expanded mental health services for veterans, youth, and rural populations, suicide prevention training for gun retailers and ranges. Why it matters. A waiting period of just 3 days can significantly reduce suicide by firearm. Treating mental health and limiting impulsive access can save thousands of lives every year. 6. Public education and culture shift. Finally, we need to address the culture around guns. That starts with education, not just legislation. We should be teaching gun safety in schools and homes. Making safe storage the norm, not the exception. Running public campaigns that de-glorify gun violence in media and entertainment. Look at how public health campaigns change the culture around smoking, seatbelts, and drunk driving. Guns should be next. Why it matters? Because the biggest shift won't happen in Congress, it'll happen in our homes, communities, and conversations.
So,
Are the solutions hard? Yes. Are they controversial? Some. But are they possible? Absolutely. What they require is will. Political will, public will, your will. Gun violence is not inevitable. It's not a virus, it's not a curse, it's a policy choice. And that means it's a policy that can be changed. Coming up next, we're closing out with a question that might haunt you. What happens if we keep doing nothing? The cost of inaction. So here we are, nearing the end of our conversation. We've walked through the facts, the failures, the policies, and the pain. But there's one last thing we have to confront, and it's a hard truth. The most dangerous choice we're making is not making one at all. This segment is called the cost of inaction, because while politicians debate and social media screams and lobbyists cash checks, people are dying. Children, elders, moms shopping for groceries, teens in high school, people sitting in church, praying, all gone. And the longer we delay, the more normalized this horror becomes. 1. More deaths, more trauma, more families shattered. Let's be crystal clear. Gun violence is now the #1 cause of death for children and teens in the United States. Not cancer, not car accidents. Guns. Every time we stall, another family gets a knock on the door they'll never forget. Another child is buried in a tiny casket. Another mass shooting trends on Twitter for a day and fades into the background noise of American life. Inaction means that fear, the fear of being shot at school or church or a movie theatre, becomes an accepted part of our lives. And that's not just tragic, that's unacceptable. 2. National desensitization. Here's the psychological reality. The more violence we witness, the more numb we become. We start to say things like, it's just the way it is, thoughts and prayers. That's the price of freedom. That's not freedom. That's apathy wrapped in patriotism. And it's costing us our souls. Inaction conditions us to believe that slaughter is a normal part of society. And that is one of the most corrosive lies of modern life. 3. The economic cost. Gun violence isn't just a human tragedy. It's a massive economic drain on our country. We're talking billions annually in healthcare costs, lost productivity, policing and incarceration, mental health care for survivors, school security systems, litigation and insurance payouts. A 2021 report estimated the total economic cost of gun violence in America is over $280 billion per year. That's not a typo. That's your tax dollars, your insurance premiums, your public resources bleeding out. Inaction is expensive and we're all footing the bill. 4. Intergenerational trauma. Here's what doesn't make headlines: the ripple effects. A 7-year-old who survives a school shooting doesn't just go back to class and shake it off. A community torn apart by gunfire doesn't magically heal because the camera's left. Gun violence leaves long shadows, PTSD in survivors, lifelong anxiety in students, emotional numbness in entire cities, intergenerational trauma that affects parenting, education, and trust. The cost of inaction is paid not just in bodies, but in wounded psyches across decades. 5. A dying democracy. And finally, here's the one we don't talk about enough. When a government repeatedly fails to protect its citizens, the very foundation of democracy begins to crack. If we can't send our kids to school without body armor, if we treat every public space like a potential war zone, if people begin to believe that no one will ever do anything, then what faith is left in our institutions? Inaction isn't just cowardice, it's a betrayal. Let me say it plain. We have a gun problem, and we know how to fix it. What we're lacking is the courage. The cost of inaction is not just blood and money. It's trust, it's innocence, it's hope. It's the silent resignation that this is just how things are now. But we can rewrite that story, because if we've made a mess with our decisions, we can also clean it up with better ones. So I'll ask you one last time, do we want to solve it, or are we going to keep pretending we can't? Gun myths that just won't die. All right, family, we've talked about the human cost, the political paralysis, the media, the trauma, but there's one more crucial thing standing in the way of progress. The myths, the narratives, the flat-out lies that people keep repeating like gospel. Welcome to segment 7, Gun Myths That Just Won't Die, because if we're going to make real change, we have to tear down the misinformation first. Myth number 1. More guns equals more safety. This is probably the most repeated line in the debate. The idea that the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. It's catchy. It's simple. It's also a fantasy. Research from the Harvard School of Public Health, Johns Hopkins, and other institutions shows the opposite. More guns, more gun deaths. Period. Households with firearms are more likely to experience accidental shootings, suicides, and domestic violence. Countries with fewer guns have fewer shootings. It's not a coincidence, and when mass shootings happen, armed civilians rarely stop them. In fact, more guns in chaotic situations often cause confusion, more casualties, or even mistaken shootings by police. So no, more guns doesn't make us safer, it makes us paranoid and more prone to tragedy. Myth number 2, it's a mental health problem, not a gun problem. Let's be real, mental health is a critical issue, but this myth is a cop-out. Every country has people struggling with mental illness, but only the US has a gun violence epidemic on this scale. Blaming mental illness shifts the focus away from the tools of violence, and worse, it stigmatizes people with legitimate mental health conditions, most of whom are more likely to be victims than perpetrators. This myth ignores the real problem: easy access to high-powered weapons by people with violent intent, not just people with a diagnosis. Myth number 3, the Second Amendment guarantees unlimited gun rights. Let's go straight to the Constitution. The Second Amendment says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The words well-regulated are right there. This was written in a time of muskets and militias, not AR-15s in the hands of civilians with no training, background check or waiting period. Even conservative legal scholars admit the Second Amendment is not a blank check. Just like free speech doesn't let you yell fire in a crowded theatre, gun rights don't mean zero regulation. We regulate driving, we regulate voting, we regulate pharmaceuticals. Why should guns, tools explicitly made to kill, be exempt? For assault weapons bans don't work. You'll hear critics say, well, the 1994 assault weapons ban didn't stop gun violence. But the facts tell a different story. During the ban, 1994 to 2004, mass shooting deaths were 70% lower than before or after. When the ban expired in 2004, mass shootings and casualties spiked dramatically. It wasn't perfect, but it was effective. Critics say criminals will find a way. Maybe, but that's like saying people will still speed, so why have traffic laws? Regulation works, it reduces harm, and that matters. Myth number 5, gun laws only hurt law-abiding citizens. This one's a favourite in gun rights circles, that laws only affect good people, and criminals won't follow them anyway. But this isn't about punishing good people, it's about raising the barrier to deadly force. Think about universal background checks, safe storage laws, red flag laws, waiting periods. None of these bans guns, but they help prevent impulsive violence, suicide, theft, and domestic shootings, which make up a massive portion of gun deaths. And polling shows that even most gun owners support these laws. So why aren't they in place everywhere? Because the myth says regulation, confiscation, and it's false. So here's what we've learned in this segment. Gun reform is being blocked not just by money and politics, but by myths. These lies comfort people. They give them a sense of control. But what they really do is get people killed. Facts don't care how catchy a slogan is. Reality doesn't bend for political theatre, and we can't build safer communities on foundations of fiction. To solve the gun crisis, we have to stop lying to ourselves first. Do we want to solve it? So here's the final question I leave you with. Do we want to solve this problem? The facts are clear. The solutions are out there. But solving America's gun problem means facing tough conversations about culture, rights, safety, and politics. It means putting aside partisan divides and focusing on saving lives. It means listening to those most affected and investing in real change. It's uncomfortable, it's hard, but it's necessary. If we truly want safer communities, fewer tragedies, and a future free of senseless gun violence, the answer has to be yes. Thanks for listening to Cluster Fudge. If this episode moved you, share it, talk about it, and most importantly, stay safe and stay informed. Until next time, I'm Alexandra.